Hi guys, I want to make a few practice videos working some problems. And so this one I'm going to focus on IR. I've chosen the multiple choice from the old homework assignment because there's a lot of different things we can talk about here. There will also just be a PDF answer key of this up if you want to look at that. But I'm going to walk through how I matched these and what you're looking for. Okay, so if I'm starting with number one, something that's important to note right here, of course, this is not an OH. So if there's anything that is confusing or a little extra messy about an IR, I will try to give you a note here. So if I know that that is not an OH, then what I'm really focusing on is the fact that I have a peak here around 3,300. I also have something here at around 2,100 and, oh goodness, 15, 16, 1,700. All right, so I have a carbonyl. I have some sort of triple bond and something at 3,300 that is not an alcohol. So that's either going to be an NH, which not any of my options, or a terminal alkyne. So that leaves me with only G. And I'm not going to circle that. Well, actually, yeah. I'll cross them out as I use them. So number one is G. You have the triple bond here. It can't be H because there's too much else going on. You have that terminal alkyne present, but then the carbonyl that lets us know that this is G. Now, one of the reasons I chose this set to do the walkthrough on is because in this particular homework assignment, I gave them a tricky problem. Something that I wouldn't give you on an exam or a quiz where you couldn't look up additional signals that I didn't ask you to memorize. So if we look at number two, from the diagnostic region, right, we have a carbonyl here in around 1,700. And if I draw a straight line up from 3,000, sorry, I tried my best to make it straight, I see that I only have sp3 CHs. So there's no hydrogens on a double bond, on a triple bond, no OHs, no NHs. Those are the only things I can see in my diagnostic region. Now, if I go to my choices, I can eliminate D because D has an aromatic ring, which would give you signals right above 3,000. I'm just looking at the carbonyls. I know it's not F because the carboxylic acid would have a much broader peak here. So I'm really left with B and E. Now, if you narrowed it down to B or E, then you're prepared for the exam. I would not ask you to decipher between B and E in a testing situation. But because this is extra practice and this time when I assigned this, it was homework, what you can do is you can go look up an IR frequency chart. And you can find distinguishing signals within the fingerprint region. And so one really important signal that is going to come from the CO stretch right here from an ester, you're going to see, if I look at this chart, a very strong peak between 1310 and 1250. If I kind of zoom in here, this is 1,200, 1,300. There is nothing right here. So I'm going to label this one as E, and then I'm going to hope that I have something that better matches B. That will come up, so be patient. I think it's the last one. So we're going to keep going through this. Now, I'm going to go to the next page, but we are going to have to keep flipping back to look at our options. Okay. Now, in number three, I have an OH. It's big, it's broad, it's around 3,300. Of course, it's going to be a range because it's so broad. If I draw a line up from 3,000, there is nothing right above 3,000. If you have a hydrogen on a carbon-carbon double bond, it literally be 3,010, 3,020. Like, it will be right above 3,000. We do have some sp3CHs, and then not much else, right? Nothing else really above 1,500. So this one's actually pretty easy. There is only one alcohol available, and it's an alkane. So it should look pretty simple and then have an alcohol. So number 3 is A. Let's look at number 4. Number 4, it tells us here, again, if it's a little bit messy, I will give you some information, right? Don't be confused. There's no carbonyl in this one. It's a little bit too low for a carbonyl anyway. Then if I draw my line up from 3,000, you have sp3CHs and sp2CHs. These sometimes are much smaller, but if you see something right above 3,000, it is going to indicate that you have a double bond of some sort. There's no carbonyls, there's no alcohols, there's no triple bonds. So what could that match? Well, what's remaining has carbonyl, triple bond, carbonyl, carbonyl. C is perfect. There is an oxygen, but there's no OH. There's no double bond. There is a double bond in it here, so that would explain that little peak above 3,000. Okay, continuing on. Let's mark that. That is going to be C. When we look at number 5, this is a cool one here. This is a great example of really paying attention to this line right here. You notice every time I've drawn that line straight up, the sp3CHs are literally backed right up to that line. They're below 3,000, but just barely. Here there's a space. So that's kind of interesting. There is something above 3,000, so that tells us that there are some sp2CHs, hydrogens on double bonds. We have our carbonyl peak right here, but these two peaks that are a little bit low to be sp3CHs, these are your two aldehyde peaks. So I mentioned that in the lecture video, and here you can see them in action, right? If we kind of zoom in here, they're right around, let's see, gosh, I should use a ruler or something, but they're right above and below 2,800. And that is very indicative of an aldehyde. Now, that alone lets you know that this is D, but something else to note here, you have sp2 hydrogens, and you have your aldehyde hydrogen, but you don't have any sp3 hydrogens. So, or CH bonds. So that's why you see this little space in here, right? So even if there was another aldehyde that maybe had an alkane piece, you'd be able to identify it from that. And let's label that as D. So that is a good example of an aldehyde if you're ever, while you're studying. Let's move on to 6. 6 is pretty clean here. We've got our sp3CHs. If I draw that line up through 3,000, there's really nothing right above 3,000. We do have a very strong peak here, but it's not broad, so it's not an OH. An NH usually wouldn't be that strong, but for one, there are no amine options in your choices, so that's helpful. But you also have this guy here, which is indicative of a triple bond, right? Either a CC or CN triple bond. So if you have a triple bond and you have this peak, right, that's how you know you have an SPCH, a hydrogen on a triple bond. There are no sp2CHs. There's no carbonyl. So even if you hadn't already gotten G, you should have been able to tell that this was H because there's no carbonyl, right? It can't be G because G would have that peak at 1,700, around 1,700. So this is H. Now, number 7, this big, huge blob in the diagnostic region, this is your carboxylic acid, right? You can't read much else when you have a carboxylic acid. It kind of swamps everything from like 2,500 up to 3,300. So, for instance, I wouldn't give you multiple carboxylic acids to contend with. You have your very clear carbonyl peak right here, very strong. There is only one carboxylic acid in your choices. It's a pretty easy one. If you're ever doing process of elimination, find that carboxylic acid and get it out. Now, 8, this is where we come back to that ester versus ketone that we saw in number 2. So again, this diagnostic region looks very similar to the number 2 IR. I draw my line up through 3,000. I only have sp3CHs. I have a carbonyl and not much else, right? So if I was given this set of options, in a test, I wouldn't be able to tell necessarily between B and E. But again, I have time to practice and to look into things. If I have an ester, right, the CO bond in an ester gives a very strong peak between 1310 and 1250. Any organic textbook will have an IR signal chart somewhere in the IR chapter. Right now, I just Googled IR chart and I went to the first link. So it's pretty easy to look into. If I go back to number 8, well, what do we have here? We have about 1,200. Very strong peak right here. And so, yay. That is most likely our ester. So that would be B. Again, if you got everything right on this matching problem, except for 2 and 8, you got them mixed up, then you're ready for the exam, right? I would not ask you to differentiate between those two on a test. But as we are talking through this and learning about IR, I think it's a fun example. I understand my definition of fun might be different than yours, but I wanted to make sure that we walked through this one together, and woohoo, we completed it. And so I hope this helps. If you have any questions, shoot me an email or come see me in office.